Fáilte. Welcome to the Village Oak Tree. I'm your host, Terrance Ó Domhnaill. Thank you for joining me. This week, we take this internal cultural and political division in the U.S. a little further. The prospect of a split up of the states in the U.S., what that might look like, and why that might not be a good idea. So gather around, sit you down somewhere comfortable for a bit, as I offer a glimpse of what the U.S. might look like in the near future. So, the State of the Union, or how the United States is heading for a breakup, and more of what that could look like. More and more, we're seeing some states fight back against Trump and his authoritarian moves. It remains to be seen how far this will go, especially with the recent court case that Trump lost regarding the legality of his deployment of federalized National Guard to Los Angeles, and the Supreme Court ruling 6-3, go figure, that he could continue to use racial profiling while the lower courts fight it out. Illinois is putting up quite a fight so far, and the whole country is watching carefully to see how far Trump will take this. The question no one is asking on mainstream news is, will there be a conflict between National Guard units on Illinois soil? Texas has volunteered to send some of their federalized troops to Illinois. Is this where we're headed as a country? We already have other states' militias, and that's what the state's National Guard is, a state-funded militia deployed to Washington, D.C., which, according to legal exports, is allowed because the District of Columbia is not a recognized state, not for lack of trying. It's becoming more and more of a probability that the United States is on its last legs as a democratic republic. As I said last week, even if the Democrats retake the House and Senate in the 2026 midterms, the damage to the economy and the reputation of the U.S. is too severe to reverse it anymore, at least in the short term. And there's a lot of speculation right now about whether the Republicans are going to allow any kind of free and fair elections in 2026. So there's a lot of people watching that. And that brings us to the other elephant in the room, the economy. I've also said this many times before. There is a recession coming soon. We're starting to see the first signs of this in the labor statistics that Trump and company want to hide from us. But mostly, we're starting to really see it in the retail stores across the country. The price of beef and chicken have more than doubled since Trump took office, at least in my local grocery store. The price of school supplies apparently was quite the sticker shock for young families this month. I'm sure there's a lot more out there for people to shake their heads over. But the worst is yet to come. The unemployment numbers are going to continue to rise as American companies are forced to scale back due to lost export sales because of the tariffs. Farmers are being forced to rethink what they're going to grow because their export markets are gone now. A lot of them are scaling back on future planning because of the loss of the export markets. People always ask, why don't they just turn around and plant food for Americans? The answer is simple. It doesn't pay them enough to maintain their farms and farm equipment to plant things like lettuce, peas, string beans, table corn, table potatoes, tomatoes, and so on. The farmers would have to have massive farm subsidies from the federal government in order to turn their farmland into table stock. We all know how Donald Trump doesn't like to pay for things by now. With factories going dark due to lost overseas markets, or like what happened a few days ago, ICE raiding a foreign car factory run by the South Koreans, and the U.S. government making a deal with South Korea to send over 300 Koreans back to Korea, effectively shutting down a huge portion of the factory. And Trump wants to bring foreign factories to the U.S. so they'll hire American workers. Yeah, right. I have a bridge for sale in New York City. This is happening across the country to meat packing plants, corporate farming, dairy farms in the north, coming soon to a city or town near you. Immigrant workers are being rounded up en masse to satisfy his bloodthirsty base, all the while gutting the economy. This is one major reason why the prices of meat products in the grocery stores have doubled in price. This is the old story of supply and demand. The demand hasn't changed all that much, just the supply, due to the lack of workers to process the meats. Plus the fact that in the last couple of years, bird flu has decimated chicken flocks and beef herds out west of the Mississippi River. So not only do Americans have to contend with food shortages, as of last week, they now have to contend with the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS for those more familiar with that acronym, over vaccines. Seems that the boss, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the man with the voice that sounds like a cement mixer full of gravel and cement, has decided to fire or lay off almost all the scientists who research the medicines that keep people safe and organize the distribution of the vaccines to the appropriate places as needed. This is the same guy who says that the measles vaccine causes autism. This is the same guy who admitted a while back that he put a dead bear carcass in New York City Central Park as a prank years ago, who now claims to be able to diagnose a sick child just by looking at them. He was grilled by a Senate Oversight Committee last week, and he was combative and unremorseful for making the U.S. a lot less safe from diseases that have been largely eradicated through the policies of mandatory vaccinations for children and adults, mostly children. Of course, everybody else in the world is running scared. This is the same guy who downplayed the measles outbreak in West Texas, where two children have died and hundreds have been sickened due to lack of vaccinations in rural areas. Western Canada managed to get their breakout under control finally, likely caused by an American tourist from West Texas. Then there is Florida. Not one to be one-upped in any way, declared that they're doing away with all state-mandated vaccinations. They claim that vaccinations should be left up to the parents as to whether to get them or not. That's not a recipe for a pandemic. I don't know what is. Does anyone remember when the Zika virus was running around Miami a couple of years ago? What about other diseases? Florida is a very humid state weather-wise, which breeds mosquitoes and other things. With no restrictions for cross-state border traffic, how soon before the U.S. has another pandemic breakout starting from Florida? In an opposite move, the West Coast states, after hearing about what RFK is doing, decided to get together and create their own mini CDC between themselves. They've taken on protecting their citizens for themselves since the federal government decided not to anymore. I expect to see more of this kind of stuff from more wealthier blue states as things regress in the U.S. If this keeps up, Canadians will probably start requiring testing before any Americans will be allowed into their country. Maybe Europe would implement a mandatory testing plan for Americans as well. I listened to a speech in Quebec by Prime Minister Mark Carney last weekend, and he's talking very strongly about working to get Canadian business steered away from the Americans and more into Europe and Asia. More diversification, in other words. Stop trading so much with the fickle Americans. He wants Canadians to buy more of their own homegrown products. Imagine that. Canada dissing the United States. I wonder how long before Latin America starts doing the same thing, especially if the U.S. invades Mexico and Venezuela. There have been more reports from independent news about how Trump's tariffs are pushing once staunch U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea to start trading more with the Chinese. India has shown everyone at the SEO conference a couple of weeks ago that they're moving away from the U.S. African countries are also moving away from the U.S., from the West, and towards the East. This is not a total shut-off, but a more measured plan to diversify and go where the best markets are. And the United States is not in anymore. Consumers are there still, but the Trump government has put a tariff wall between the American consumer and the rest of the world. It's the Americans who will end up suffering the most from all this. As we can see, the countries of the world are no longer concerned with American consumer markets anymore, and they're turning around to sell everywhere else. With imports becoming too expensive for the average American consumer to purchase, and no domestic products available to replace the imports that the Americans used to take for granted, we're starting to see shortages everywhere now. For now, it's the little things, but as warehoused inventories get used up, we're seeing the prices trickle up, which will soon be a flood. There will be food shortages soon, very obvious ones. I've mentioned a couple of times this last summer about seeing certain products become unavailable at my local grocer anymore, or severely delayed in being restocked by weeks in some cases. I picked up several articles this week about what a split would look like if the individual states decided to start going their own way. I talked a lot about this last week, And I have more from Chris Armitage and another person this week. He advocates that states set up shadow services that mirror the federal services that used to come from Washington, D.C., using money that they would have ordinarily sent to D.C. that is normally redistributed back to the states, which a disproportionate amount of red states take more than they give into the feds. And no surprise there. He also writes that if the wealthy blue states were to stop sending their money to the federal government and were to use it to take care of their own citizens instead, life would be a lot better than it is now. The U.S. could do away with entities like the new War Department and the military bases overseas. Imagine how much money could be given back to the people if the United States no longer had $1 trillion a year War Department. Each state would be responsible for their own defense, and that's what they have a National Guard and police force for. I'm betting there will be a lot less wars around the world if the U.S. was only paying for its own internal defenses state by state. Same could be said for the economy. If the individual states were only responsible for their own state economies, then each state would sink or swim based on their trade policies and state finances. We already know how the West Coast would fare. California being the fourth largest economy in the world. Add to that the economies of Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington State, and they would be near unstoppable. Many in other parts of the country, what if New York were to go it alone? Maybe collaborate with their immediate neighbors, such as Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Rhode Island, and maybe even as far north as Upper New England, turning the entire Northeast into one happy, wealthy family. Given their attitudes for the most part, that's not that far-fetched of an idea. What about New Mexico and Colorado? They also could do something for themselves, along with the upper Midwest. Once again, it's all about the money. Who has it and who doesn't? There are a couple of red states who could manage to keep their heads above water, but the rest of them, as Chris Armitage points out, they're already living beyond their means with massive federal subsidies. What happens if that money dries up? You would have a mass exodus of people who are wealthy enough to leave, and a massive humanitarian crisis for those who can't afford to leave. Then you have a refugee crisis within the borders of the United States, possibly even a war between states who don't have enough to live on against neighboring states that do have extra resources. Classic human tribalism, American style. I do agree that something needs to be done to even things out amongst the states and the American population in general. The idea of stopping the money flowing to the federal government is probably not a good solution unless something else more equitable could be worked out. The Americans did away with the federal government in its current form. What then? Maybe just have a flat rate state tax from each state sent to a clearinghouse that states can petition to draw from, with a governing board that would vote on whether the need was great enough to dole out some money. Of course, with human greed in play, we all know how that would work out. I think Chris's idea about each state being autonomous has merit. He writes, if a state government can't be physically responsible and the citizens end up in a humanitarian crisis, then the citizens can abandon that state and petition to immigrate to another state. He also talks about the states instituting some sort of cross-state border passport system to stop people from just relocating at a whim, similar to the EU system. Although the EU system is coming under fire these days for being too open to refugees. There are now too many refugees in the EU countries to handle, and it's eating heavily into their social services programs. You just know that this would happen in the U.S. too, if each state became their own little countries or just more autonomous without any federal government oversight, humans being humans and all. What the U.S. would have are pockets of dire poverty, with the poorest people unable to flee the authoritarians in the red states, draconian laws restricting people's civil rights, and a refugee crisis mirroring places like the African continent. You would have armed militias sponsored by these authoritarian state governments making forays into wealthier states to steal their resources or just plain invade them altogether for the same reasons. You can't change human nature. When humans who feel deprived see another tribe with better stuff, they become resentful and eventually they commit violence to take those resources. Although I like Chris's idea of the 50 states becoming autonomous entities unto themselves, We all know that humans being humans, the poorest among them would never agree to live peacefully alongside another state that was wealthier than them for very long. I have another article from a Medium.com writer, an expat living outside of the US, who wrote a story that mirrors my own from the last couple of podcasts. His idea is similar to Chris Armitage's, but also somewhat like the map I showed everyone last week. And no, I'm not going to bring it back up again. Um, he or she, they write under the pseudonym of Religion and Politics at the Dinner Table, writes that the United States could become more like territorial enclaves, New England being one, the Northwestern states, West Coast, the Dixie Confederation, Texas absorbing New Mexico, and so on. Very similar to my map from last week, only with the cultural differences between the mountain states up in the Northwest, like Montana, Wyoming, then New England. The Dixie Confederation would be everything from Virginia west, going all the way past Missouri, and out into the western mountain ranges. No matter how you slice up the United States, certain regions would not be content to remain in their initial borders. For those whose regional economies were to become wealthy enough, they would stand up an army and invade someone else eventually. Can you imagine the Dixie states, to include all the original Confederate states from 1860, deciding to invade New England, or the upper Midwest blue states because they're wealthier than they are? Can you imagine the Texas Empire to include what used to be New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Arizona going to war with Southern California for water? I think the Americans need a federal government reset. Instead of breaking up into a bunch of warring states, they need to figure out a way to work together to create a more equitable financial distribution of the federal taxes the states pay in. Said taxes being a flat rate tax across the board so that every state pays an equal share. No more of the wealthier states subsidizing the poorer states. Will there be a disparity between the finances of the states? Absolutely. There will always be states who make more money than the others. But if states that don't have a lot of money are still able to provide a decent standard of living for citizens, there wouldn't be as much animosity between them. The U.S. should get rid of the overreaching federal government and turn it into a clearinghouse for the states, a central hub where resources can be distributed to places that need them, such as after extreme weather events. The United States doesn't need a president or a Congress as they have now. Each state already has a central government. Let them determine the state's needs. If the states aren't sending so much money into the federal government anymore, they would have more for their citizens. The federal government doesn't need a standing military running all over the world, meddling in other countries' affairs. As Chris talks about in his article, imagine if defense contractors had to negotiate prices with each individual state for their products. What if all these other corporations were forced to do the same? Prices would be set on the abilities of the citizens to pay based on their standard of living. The U.S. government could have a humanitarian program like USAID, but it would have to be voted on by the states as to what it would do and where, and not at the expense of state citizens. This would also apply to trade policies, as Chris laid out. Each state should be responsible for its own trade policies. They should be responsible for whom they trade with, what they export and import, and pricing thereof. They can make deals with other states for transport corridors, for access to seaports. They can make deals for pipelines to bring energy products to their states across borders, much like Europe does now. But no, Americans still think they own the world, and the world owes them a tribute, at least according to Trump anyway. We see how that's working out for them. All this speculation about the split up of the states in the Union is just that for now, speculation. But with Trump crashing the American economy right now, this may become more than speculation within the next decade or two. How do you see the United States in the near future? If the states were to separate, how do you think they would split up? Would they split into 50 different autonomous states? Would they separate into territorial regions based on ideologies? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. So it's now time for my break. So after I return, I'll read the chapter that I promised you last week of The Priest by Michael Campy. I want to take a couple of minutes to explain how you can support what I'm doing here. either through a direct donation, a subscription, or purchase in my book. First, let me say I don't monetize my work up front, but I'm not adverse to asking for donations of any amount or currency on my website for paid subscriptions to my Substack page if you have the ability to do so. My annual or monthly subscription rates are as low as Substack will allow, if that helps. If nothing else, like, follow, restack, or sign up for a free subscription and share with anyone you wish to add my voice to the many in the independent media who don't like what's happening to people around the world. I may not be able to join any street protests, but I can surely protest here. I appreciate everyone who tunes in to watch, listen, or read my thoughts about how all of this is affecting us. I realize that I'm just one voice among the many, but that's how a rebellion gets its start. We start by raising our collective voices to be heard loud and clear by those who would attempt to take away our rights and freedoms. Americans had one rebellion in the 1770s to stop a tyrant, and we can always start another one. In Ireland, they've had many rebellions through the centuries to stop the tyrant kings of the past, so my ancestors have a lot of experience with that. Let me finish up by showing you this little video about my dystopian fiction story I wrote, Fugitives in the United States. If this story sounds interesting, go to any major book retailer around the world to order it, or order a hardcover or paperback version on my website and read it for yourself. The way things are starting to go in the U.S., the story may not be fiction for much longer. Watch this video and decide for yourself if you think this story is starting to become a reality now.
James had one dream: to save lives. But in a country torn apart by hate and fear, his own life became the ultimate battle. A new government driven by prejudice. A system that left no room for those like him. Immigrant, Muslim and brown-skinned. Forced to abandon his life and live as a fugitive, he fought to survive in a country that saw him as an enemy. Every step brought new risks and unexpected alliances. But in the darkest moments, love found him. And together, they discovered that even in a state of despair, hope could still bloom. This is the story of one man's fight for freedom, survival, and love.
Welcome back. So, as always, I'll bring you a chapter from Michael Campy's book, The Priest, here in his little bits. Just to kind of give people an idea of what the United States could look like in the future. So, as always, let me pull it up and I'll read it to you. Pull myself out of it here. You can follow along as best you can. So we got The Priest, formerly known as Bob, Part 44 by Michael Campy. Viva Lake Tahoe. It is 21 miles from Gardnerville to Lake Tahoe. We could do that in about 10 hours if we pushed it a bit, and we were all in the mood to push and get past the child eaters. Considering that we had just killed 3 of them, we thought it best to get by as quickly and as quietly as possible. We had not heard anything from the people who were following us, and that lent an air of uncertainty to our travels. It was like waiting for the collapse. You knew something was going to happen, you just didn't know when or how bad it would be. Poor and Dolly were the only 2 of us that didn't lose any sleep over it. They had maybe taken acceptance to a new level, and death was no longer of any concern to them. I knew people in the old world that had claimed to not care whether they lived or died because of how bad things might get. But across the board, when push came to shove, they found out that they had been deceiving themselves and they really did care. I also knew a couple of people who had killed themselves, a walking the walk sort of thing, but they were few and far between. Most people, when confronted with their imminent demise, squealed like stuck pigs or soiled themselves like Stuffy had done. Getting past Gardnerville turned out to be easier than we thought. Maybe they were hunkering down because of what we had done. It would have been kind of a drag if they had decided to come after us too. The situation was pretty Wild West, with all the little frontier towns having their own laws. The difference is there is absolutely no laws or controls of any kind in a collapse scenario on base human traits like violence, cannibalism, and just plain ugliness. Despite the apparent success we experienced getting past the town, we stayed watchful until we were sure there was no one following us. What had come as a surprise to me after the collapse, or maybe it wasn't that surprising, was the apparent lack of any type of egalitarian groups. There had been a lot of talk about that before, with people forming what they called intentional communities or communes, or villages devoted to higher values. From what I have seen, the higher values they claim to have and their ideas about peaceful, loving humans in peaceful, loving groups fell away pretty fast as soon as they were confronted with the reality of the situation. Starvation, thirst, competition for resources, and just staying alive turned peaceful, loving humans into snarling, self-centered, vicious rodents in less time than it took to miss a few meals. If I ever get access to a time machine and I can send a note back to the pre-collapse world, I would tell them, you are not who you think you are. Make adjustments and act accordingly, and be prepared to deal with the fallout that will come as everything you thought was good about you disappears. I would perhaps give them a mantra to recite as they go through life, something along the lines of, I am not good, I am not compassionate, I will kill anyone who stands between me and that can of Chef Boyardee. Maybe that would get them ready on some level. Came down the road into Lake Tahoe just about sunrise. It looked a lot like all the other places that had been abandoned. There were cars parked every which way, like the owners just got out of them and left. The buildings had been raided. The windows were all broken. Some of the roofs had collapsed. And it was obvious that a place like Lake Tahoe had suffered a lot when exposed to the killing heat that had previously been something they didn't have to worry about. I wondered about what had happened to all the bodies. There was a disconnect between the number of people who had died and the bodies that should have resulted from a mass die-off. Maybe they'd been like dogs and just crawled off somewhere to curl up and pass on. It was weird, though. I began to look for a place to hole up and sleep. I remembered there had been a place where there were a bunch of little cabins that sat on a rocky beach somewhere around here. We rounded a corner, and there, standing in the middle of the road, there was a massive human. He had a beard that tumbled down over a belly that looked like a kettle. He was dressed in overalls, wearing some seriously dangerous-looking boots with a flannel shirt that could double as a circus tent for any normal-sized folks. He was chewing on a piece of straw and resembled an incredibly large hillbilly Santa Claus. He was smiling and was surrounded with smaller versions of himself, both male and female. We stopped dead in our tracks. He looked at us with a combination of surprise and interest. There were even a couple of children, which made Tiki light up, because it told him that they did not eat little ones. The big man stepped forward, put out his hand, and said, "Howdy, folks. What brings you to our little corner of hell?" So that's what I have for you here. I appreciate you coming in and listening to me this week again. Gorima Haggett. Thank you for watching or listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it. You'll return again to listen to the news and stories I find every week. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this quote by Samuel Adams in 1774. "Courage then, my countrymen. Our contest is not only whether we ourselves shall be free, but whether there shall be left to mankind an asylum on earth for civil and religious liberty." Slongo Foyle.